Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start as well by acknowledging being on the unceded ancestral lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish First Nation. It's great to be here doing business like this. Thank you all for staying for this anchor presentation on forestry. It's exciting that we still have an audience. And I'm actually grateful that I've got an extra half hour to talk about this, because this is this is an exciting place for me. I think I might be, I'm a new member of the ECDEV support team. I just got started with one meeting with the team. I think I might be the most undereducated person that's on that team. I feel very privileged to be here, to be part of it, to be working with this group and the effort the path that they've built with the New Relationship Trust, how they've put this together in the last couple of years. It's very exciting to be welcomed on board and to do some of this work. My experience, as Chan said, and in my bio, is I'm Snuneymuxw from the Nanaimo on my mother's side. My father's also from the Nanaimo, but he's a Scottish-English background, and he was an entrepreneur. He did forest management consulting as a career, so I got introduced to the world of consulting forest management very young. And I think what you'll hear a lot in my talk today, and what's interesting about where we're at with First Nations and forestry, is a lot of the moral conflict of being in the forest sector and what you're doing, and whether that's the right thing to be doing right now, and how do we do it, and how do we get benefit out of what we're doing here. So I was introduced to the consulting world with my father's attitude and approach as an entrepreneur. I really appreciated that. I quickly had conversations with some elders in our family from a First Nations perspective, and I was challenged with, well, should I stay in forestry or not? Is that going to actually be my career? Because it seems to conflict with the values in our communities. And I was guided early on to say, well, get in there and be part of the forest sector and learn how it operates, get to the knowledge piece, and then never lose our traditional values and incorporate them, bring them into the system somehow. But use it to our benefit if you can, make something out of it. And that's what I've done. And I spent most of my young career doing consulting management with my father. When I finished, he forced me into university if I wanted to stay in the company, so I toughed it out by going through university and getting a degree. When I finished, I wanted to start my own company. I actually wanted to be doing this work with First Nations, so I entrepreneured out myself and started forest management consulting for about 4 years. And I quickly saw that this work was back in the early 90s, and there wasn't a lot of forest land that our communities were managing. The work that I started doing was for Macmillan Bloedel and these other big companies that were occupying our territories and had the rights to the timber. And so my company was Aboriginal people, but we were just working for these non-Aboriginal big integrated companies. I kind of abandoned that because I couldn't see the value in it and where I was going. And my career really shifted in 2000 when the Nisga'a finally made it to their treaty award after a generation of work. And I saw the opportunity and I applied, and I was accepted to work with their team. And I had a great experience for 3 years in the Nass Valley in a treaty environment, actually managing land and resources for a nation, for the people who were those owners that were Aboriginal. It absolutely changed, but highlighted my career path by moving from this consulting forest management. We've talked about, and we'll talk about implementing tenure, that very onerous job of procedure and policy to make stuff work, and the business planning, to a nation building component. What would you do at the nation level to actually inform and guide forestry? Grateful for that experience, but the coast called me home after a few years, and we returned closer to family, or I did some more consulting. And then this opportunity with the First Nations Forestry Council became in my line of sight, where I could actually now come into an environment where it's a society put in place by all of our communities, and the times have changed so much where the Nisga'a Nation are showing land title and management of lands in the early 2000s because of, I think, a lot of what we heard about this governance, title frameworks. The province started a program where they were awarding forest tenure to our communities, and we amazingly have been taking them on. So since 2002, we have this huge number of First Nations with forest tenure. And the First Nations Forestry Council got created to help manage some of that. It got initially created because of mountain pine beetle. But after, I think it's about the third or fourth iteration of trying to organize around forestry by First Nations to do this kind of work, to build the capacity to gain control of title and rights and implement and get benefit from the forest sector. And a lot of the previous organizations didn't make it because that governance house, that authority, that recognition of our title wasn't in place. And we were still waiting and asking for BC what they're going to offer us so we could participate. And so it's a very dynamic time to be changing that whole way of thinking, all the hard work that our nations and leaders have done to break down these barriers and then create this opportunity. So I wanted to share that because it's my education is more in my career choices and my path and what I've learned from our communities and where their work is and where their focus is, and then that's what I'm bringing today, and that's what I want to talk about on how we maximize this opportunity, and it really is a significant opportunity right now. So, there we go. So, what we've heard, and I'm learning a little bit about it as a new member of this team, is the assertion process that has been developed for the last couple of years by New Relationship Trust in this team. I'm going to talk about the forest sector. I'm going to talk about this stage 5 implementation. Tremendous presentations today and yesterday about how to prepare, how to plan, how to engage, all those criteria that are needed in getting to the stage of having a tenure. The forest sector in British Columbia, like I was just mentioning, is now, I think, over about 170 of the 203 First Nations in the province have gone into agreements to get tenure, and they're working in the forest sector trying to implement a forest tenure of some sort, or they have tried it and maybe abandoned it. Some have done it repeated times in the last 15 years. And collectively, we have between 10 and 15% of British Columbia's harvest. So one of the world's leading forest sector, forest product producers in the world, we control collectively almost 15% of that in a kind of a weird relationship. I think we will all agree that it's not the best one right now, but it is something. That's the province's direct award program, or their First Nations forest strategy, they're starting to call it now, that they started in about 2002, I think the first tenure got introduced. Interesting part of implementation, and especially forest tenure, and this huge number, this significant participation and uptake by our communities, is all of these other stages that come before implementation. And I think some of the biggest challenges we've had are the province felt the pressure of title and rights, the pressure of our leadership emerging in 2000, and they created this program to offer tenure. They created this thing, this opportunity, they called it. And we jumped at it, I'd say. A lot of these other stages weren't put in place to think through accepting this forest tenure opportunity. We didn't put together a lot of that material that we've been talking about. And it's really clear to me in hindsight that that happened, where, wow, why we weren't there, we didn't create those steps, we didn't complete them, and it's no wonder we're missing the opportunity, or the opportunity is failing us. And now after a few years, you're actually looking back and going, I don't know if I'm going to sign this again. I'm going to get out of this because we actually have to get to the proper level of negotiation, our engagement. We're not aligned properly. The businesses is the other interesting part of this in terms of economic development. Forest sector businesses have just sprouted up because of this tenure. And that's, we heard it really quickly in the last couple of days, but there's a lot of complexity to creating a business to manage one of these kinds of forest tenures. And there are various kinds, as you know, and I'll talk about it briefly, but how to prepare, plan your business on its own and that construct and its relationship with your nation and how you make it work compared to the actual forestry implementation, all of the criteria that makes the forest sector work and hum and be successful. The forest sector is in an absolute challenging transition right now. Humongous, tremendous wealth from the forests have been liquidated over the last 100 years around here. It's been extracted. The valuable old growth is almost complete in its extraction, and we're moving into second growth forests, a whole new dynamic in the province. The forest sector suffers from the climate change impacts of the mountain pine beetle. It suffers from international competition in supplying fiber, this timber resource, to the world. And so its competition at the global level is getting very fierce and challenging. So the sector is on this decline. Right at the same time, First Nations are moving in, asserting our title and winning and starting to claim back our fair share and role in the sector. We're not welcome in that change, that challenge for the sector. We're not very welcome there. And a big part of what we're doing in the challenge is to fix that relationship, to find out which companies are good partners to work with, how the government can actually bend and allow us to get our title back, and we can build our proper presence in what First Nations forestry is going to look like in the future and how it can really be healthy here in this part of the world. So what I want to talk about in my slides, I'll try to keep it moving along, is an overview of the tenure management, very specifically this phase of implementation. We've got the tenure acquisition piece. You have to have this tenure for this presentation. You have to get a tenure, and you're going to have to start working it. So you've done some planning. You've agreed to the deal. You've made some kind of deal, and now you've been awarded a tenure. And it's significant because I've often talked about how I'm amazed at how many of our nations are actually accepting these deals, because they're not all great opportunities. But here you are, you've got it. How do we make the best of it? Business structure, great presentations already today about the business structure you have to have, the options. That's got to be in place. For a number of reasons, we'll talk about those briefly because it's already been covered. Budgets and financial planning. I think this is probably where the standard budgeting and finance for a business, that I don't need to cover that, but what I'm going to try and open your mind to is how you link the financial accounting to the production of a forest tenure and how that actually is important and valuable for your understanding. Because not everybody needs to become a professional forester and understand the very details, but as a tenure owner, you need to understand some of those management principles of this tenure and what you have. The operational planning, this is critical, it's complex. Like Judith's presentation about permitting, forestry's got a ton of permitting. It's incredible how much it is. I actually often talk about the permitting structure, the regulatory framework, as something that's been created by the industry to protect them so that they actually can get permission to keep doing what they want to do because it's legal now. It's in this really interesting framework that allows them that protection. You got to be able to navigate that if you're going to take on a Crown tenure and run it. And then we have a whole nother challenge of how we want to do that on our own terms. So you got all this planning work to do, and then you have the tenures management, its actual operations, implementation. We're actually doing some very serious impacts to the environment, building roads. We're knocking down very old forests and changing the landscape. And then you have a business model that says you got some metrics there that you're going to have to hit and achieve for success. You need to manage that. Somebody has to manage that, and you just can't. You can't delegate this stuff out too much. You want to own it. I heard something also earlier today about, and part of what I love about forestry is I actually am on the land. I am in our territory, and I am seeing what we're doing, what we're trying to do, what other people are doing. That's a fantastic part of getting our youth involved in the sector, is get them in the territory and seeing what's going on. And the last one I'll go through is review and improve, continuous improvement. It's huge. It's a huge concept in forestry. We're 15 years into accepting tenures and managing them. Have we been reviewing and improving what we're doing each year? Are we critically looking at it because we're learning? Are we gaining that knowledge in our nation so that we can make the decisions and not get locked into long-term deals with some industry partner who is securing their own future, but us adapting, because we have to adapt through a very transformative period of taking back control and participation in our lands and resources. So let's start with the tenure acquisition. Because you've negotiated, or if we think about those 6 phases, you've gone through the steps and you've negotiated, or maybe what unfortunately might have happened is the province knocked on the door and offered it, and you looked at it and said, okay, I'll take that. And now you've got a tenure awarded. The common framework is right now a forest consultation and revenue sharing agreement. The province has something they want out of that agreement, so that's why they're offering it. They're getting something from your nation by signing a FCURSA, I call them, the consultation revenue sharing agreement. It used to be the FROs and the FRA, then the FRO, now it's the FCURSA, and then there's also the Forest Tenure Opportunity Agreement. For those of you that have seen this is the standard way of the Crown inviting this opportunity, offering this opportunity, and setting it up for communities. And they're very proud of the fact of the number of communities that have signed these. That's a metric for success, that they've got the communities engaged in this agreement. It doesn't actually, the FCURSA isn't actually the tenure. There might actually be a step now of implementing where you have to find the tenure. So this is often where things can get really overwhelming because a whole bunch of stuff should have happened by now. Maybe it hasn't, and now maybe a whole bunch of things have to happen at once. The operational review, the validation and verification of a business plan, or the concept that this opportunity is a good opportunity, or where is the volume coming from for your tenure? Is it actually identified? Is it in, what kind of tenure is it? Some of these agreements got signed and the tenure was never found in the territory. They couldn't resolve it. You never actually got the tenure even though you signed the agreement. There's the concepts around sustainable volume versus short-term volume. Almost all of the vast majority of the tenures being offered are 5-year non-replaceable agreements. And so it's a short period of time. It's one chunk of volume. you don't know what's going to happen after the 5-year period. It's very limiting opportunity. And it could be a very small volume as well. So there's been a whole bunch of challenges in the viability of the opportunity and knowing that whether it's going to be viable and work for you. Common in forest tenures is it area-based or volume-based? So that's all part of the provincial management regime, whether they give out actual geographic areas of land to manage to one company, or whether you're in a shared management area with a bunch of licensees looking for volume for you to harvest. When you're in a shared area, you're actually competing with those other licensees now because everybody's looking for that best quality wood in the same area. And that created quite another unhealthy environment for our communities to step into, where partnerships are more challenging because we're actually taking away from industry. And so this environment of an opportunity might have been good in some cases, but in a lot of cases it creates a negative pressure on the industry, who, as I said, the industry is coming down and it's trying to restructure itself. And here we are getting our piece. Industry doesn't want us to get the best piece of what's out there. They want it for themselves. They need it for their own business. Very competitive. Now we're pitted against industry. That's a competitive, unhealthy environment from my perspective. And so what happens is you might have been offered a tenure. You've got to do some of this homework right away. You've got to find a way to understand and look at the land base, the opportunity, where is it at? You've got to put your business plan together and make that all line up. And you can't go to the full extent of that very comprehensive, detailed assessment. You have to have some high-level reconnaissance and capacity to look at it and be comfortable with what the tenure actually looks like. So we've had some really good discussion about the business structure. We've heard about the challenges of the politics versus the business environment, the options, lots of limited partnerships out there now. One of the cores here from my perspective is team development. You've got to find that capacity solution around the forest sector. And that has been its own challenge for us, as I was alluding to. When we're given an opportunity, but then we're competing against the rest of the sector isn't aligning with us very readily because we're competing for the limited valuable resources. And if we don't have our own capacity and our own people, then we're at a disadvantage. And this has been a very challenging piece for us. And it's a different crowd. The consultants, contractors that work in the forest sector have been going through their own dynamic in the sector. 20, 30 years ago, when I was first introduced to the forest sector, there was a larger number of bigger companies. They had their own crews. They had their own staff, employees that took care of a lot of this work. And there was a very small community of consultants, and they just looked after little edge pieces of the work that the big companies couldn't handle on their own. And it was a different dynamic. Log brokers, we've talked about that, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit more. They're the same thing. The companies traditionally do that internally. But the log brokers were there to help with specialty markets, specialty value-added pieces. They'd find really unique markets for the big companies. As the sector's been going through its decline, it's gone through a number of changes. A lot of the big companies have gotten rid of their staff workers, and they've pushed them out to become the consultants and contractors so they could reduce their own liabilities of their workforce. So the consultant world kind of grew, but it's not a big sector. It's a small crowd of people. And so a lot of these consultants are, Used to work for McMillan Blodell. Now I'm a contractor for. They're basically an employee there, doing that job with quite a bit of loyalty, and the environment isn't this this open environment where you could grab somebody and they would work for your interests and your benefit. And there's not a lot of the cross-cultural understanding of working for our communities and how to do that in a meaningful way without just trying to guide it and control it. And so these business structures have been extremely challenging because it's a whole new level of partner that's in the sector. And I'm just adamant about the workforce development of our own people and trying to promote our own people getting into the sector. Get the job, get the experience. We have to learn how this thing operates, and we have to then, and on its way, incorporate our own values into it. And I heard it a little bit about these businesses as well as, and I've lived through a lot of it where the business deals had objectives of employment for First Nations people, and 5 years or 10 years later, what happened to that employment? It didn't happen. Oh, well, this is why, this long list of excuses why our people didn't get that employment. Now 10 years has gone by and we've missed all of that learning curve. And I just don't think that's acceptable. It's certainly not acceptable anymore. Some people have to be accountable to doing that job that they said they were going to do, not just looking after themselves, and they shouldn't be welcome back. So that's a big part of the dynamic in the partnerships and the business structure. That's important. The planning and the budgets. This is, I think we talk. There's kind of enough talk about the business side of the tenure, the plan for success, the budget, how to start up a business, where to get your financing, how you can do that if you need it. Forestry suffers heavily from lack of financing in getting going on seems like it's not a big deal, a small volume of cut. It's a very small percentage relative to the sector probably that you're managing in your territory, but it's big money, and you don't get paid on a forest tenure until you actually deliver that log to market. That's at the very end of a long period of time of planning and development and very expensive operational costs before you actually sell it and get paid. And then you have to finance that somehow. And unfortunately, what's happened in the past is most people have had some partner financing for you because it's hard to find financing. Thanks to Michelle, it's getting easier, I think. That presentation opened my eyes to some other tracks, but it's critical that we get the business control. This is that business foundation. We got to control that. We can't just let these other partners control too much of it. And I really think our partners, our non-Aboriginal partners, control too much of our forestry opportunities right now. So you've got to do the planning, you've got to do the budgets, and like a business plan, your budgeting has to be alive to the changing conditions. The forest sector's a very seasonal sector. It's got a lot of seasonal ups and downs. It's got a crazy market environment in the last decade or so. Understanding what may or may not happen and how to adjust and stay on track is really important. I'll talk a little bit more about pro forma scorecards, because I think that's one of the key messages for this audience is you have to have some way of having your team, whoever it is, whether it's your own people or a partner or consultants, report to you on these elements of the business and in a way that you know you can understand and make the decisions. So you've got some planning and budgets, you've got a company set up, you've got this other process with your nation and relationship. You got to know who's in charge. Somebody's got to be making decisions. A lot of times the decisions get given away to our partner because they're financing it, and if they're financing it, they're going to take control of it for you. that's where we start losing control a lot. And we have to make these plans and management work for our benefit. So let's try and talk about the operational planning, because the operational planning is a lot of times where the moral conflict the rubber hits the road, where most of our communities are heavily concerned that the forest sector has degraded our territories, that it's actually damaging the environment. Now here we are, we've accepted a forest tenure, and we're going to go out and build a road and cut down some trees and log it to make money. Are those things aligned? You have to have some confidence and certainty that we've made a decision, this is going to be okay. When it comes to operational planning on your forest tenure, you don't really have much say anymore about what happens. This is a Crown tenure you've accepted. This is the BC government, as Doug White was talking about it earlier, they still claim ownership here. This is their legal system about what you have to do, but you will have to do it to make your business work on a tenure. And one of the key things about operational planning is the higher level plans that inform what happens. So we've got stewardship plan on here. We've talked a little bit about land use planning and comprehensive community plans. These higher level plans, if you do them and you express them to people, they become what has to be followed. And you can't really just do it after the fact. If it's not there, a forester is going to do the plan with whatever higher level plans are in place. They'll adhere to those laws, they'll get it done, and it'll be approved, and away you go. So that's where you got to back up, or in our case, we're all in it. Everybody's in here now. You've got to get to those higher level plans. The nation has to look at those things. They have to put it down, and then we should be fighting to make sure that they're adopted by BC at very least. And people shouldn't be operating in your territory without following them. Then it's very easy for operational planning to get processed. In British Columbia, you have to be a professional forester to sign off and approve that a cut block gets harvested or a road gets built. It has to go through a process, and it's not the Ministry of Forests anymore. It's actually just an independent professional forester. There's a Foresters Act that says these people work because in British Columbia, the land is owned by the public. The government controls it on behalf of the public citizens of BC. The corporations have the tenure, but a forester has to sign and seal the documents. They have to show that this work was done properly. They have to show that a forest stewardship plan was done to take into account all the higher level planning that takes into account the protection and conservation of non-timber resources. You have to identify individual cut blocks, do the work consistent with the legislation. A forester has to sign off and review that any of these plans are consistent with the legislation. They are legally solid plans. The province asks that in order to plan and log, you're actually going to have to do technical work in assessing what is the timber and the timber quality, the value of the timber. They need to know the value of what the Crown's resource is. They need to know the species and the grade distribution of every tree that's being proposed to be taken. And they want to know how much it's costing, what's a fair and reasonable cost to extract it and do the work. And the difference is going to be the stumpage that the government's trying to collect. Say, hey, BC says this is our timber. Sure, we'll give you the license to cut wood, but you're going to have to tell us what the value is. You're going to have to show us some expenses, and we're going to take the difference. You can have a fair profit for your business, but we're taking the rest because it's significant wealth, and it's for British Columbia. That's the number we're sharing, right? That's the stumpage number we're sharing. in our revenue sharing agreements. The province collects its stumpage and it shares a little bit of it with First Nations. But what I'm trying to show you is how the government of BC has expressed its laws about what you have to do to manage a tenure. We're following their laws here. Hopefully we're all also thinking about how we're going to implement our own. Nisga'a have the Nisga'a Forest Act. They have their own ability to write the laws that you have to follow on Nisga'a lands. This is the BC's laws and what we have to follow. You've got cutting permits and road permits. So you've got some higher level planning. You've done some of that work. Now you've sent some technicians out. They've actually identified where a road's going to get built. They've seen it on the ground. Professionals have come in. If you think it's necessary to bring in a fisheries biologist, you bring one in. Somebody has to sign off that fisheries isn't negatively being impacted by the building of this road. If it's a visual thing, this is an example of a computer-generated cut block proposed plan and the visual impact that's going to be created from a certain viewpoint. There's rules about that. You have to plan for that. Some technicians have to figure out how to take where this proposed road and cut block is and create a visual impact assessment and say, okay, that's not too much of an impact, or it meets the criteria from the higher level plannings that said that visuals are important to a certain level. All of that detail has to be sorted out and signed off by a professional. So you're really following the law is what the professionals are doing. But it's not going unnoticed, and I think that's the important part. And it's kind of like Judith was talking about. It's heavy on the process, heavy on the permitting, all these stages you're going to have to go through. Marketing and sales, that's a big deal in the operational planning. You really need to understand the value of your product. That's the timber product. You need to know that there's some certainty about what that is worth, so it's going to cover the costs that you're projecting. Somebody's going to do a technical review of where that road's located. They're going to estimate the cost of dynamite to blow up the rock to put a road in there. They're going to estimate the bridges and their costs. You're going to have a total comprehensive cost estimate of building the road, the cost of logging by phase. You got to have all this stuff, and you have to show it to the government of BC that you've done that due diligence, that this is realistic, and then this is how we're going to move forward. And you have to have a silviculture plan. Interestingly enough, planting trees didn't become law for BC. They didn't really care about planting trees till the 1980s. That's only when silviculture became this, oh, we should really be planting trees after we log. That's not very long ago. And so if you think about what the Crown's been doing in their stewardship, they've just been liquidating high-value logs. They're following some laws, and it's very good standards in many senses. But some of it's pretty new. Planting trees and silviculture and tending to the land like that, that's pretty new stuff. When First Nations talk about how they want to treat the land, I think there's quite a difference there. But so operational planning is a heavy piece of work. I'd say that's where most of my career actually is. If you're promoting technicians and foresters, that's what they're doing in the business of timber harvesting, is learning how to go through all of those steps, going out and looking at the timber, making the plans, putting it together. And you're really understanding. You're doing wildlife habitat assessments out there. You're doing cultural impact assessments for communities, the fisheries. You're looking at everything, but you're focused on the timber because that's what you're going to sell as a product, and you're going to focus on the cost to get that timber out of there. But it's a big piece of work, and it's a great place for a career and getting on the land. And it's more importantly a piece of understanding the impacts and then what good management means to our people and on our lands. And so that part is really the piece where we've got to promote some ownership from our own people? How do we get more of our understanding of this, what's going on here? This is the dynamic that tells us what the impact really is. The business side is, and I think if I looked back at all of these tenure opportunities that we've accepted, I used to say, oh, well, we took it because it's a ECDEV opportunity. I mean, clearly we are not influencing stewardship values by taking these tenures. We're getting an opportunity to cut down whatever it is, 20,000 cubic meters of timber from your area. Maybe that's what your deal is. You're not there to say, oh, what are our traditional values say about stewardship and protection of streams and whatnot. That's not what the tenure is. The tenure is to go log the timber following BC's laws. So we can do that. We can lay out the timber. What I think is important is most people took it because it's it's a money generator. If you've got 20,000 cubic meter cut block and you're going to log it, you need to know the revenue. You need to know the selling price. What is 20,000 cubic meters of timber in your territory going to sell for? You should know that. That's not that hard to figure out. You can look it up. BC government posts what they see as the average selling price of timber. Every month they record it. They look at the average by species, by grade. Oh, I've got it right here. And on the coast as of October 16th, the average price of selling wood logged on the coast, $132 per cubic meter. That's the average. If you're selling high-grade cedar, you're at about $500 a cubic meter you're selling that cedar for. And you've got all these iterations. Part of the operational planning is, well, how much high-grade cedar do we have? Or how much of it is low-grade? How much of it's hemlock? What are the other species? It's all posted. You can quickly see that. And I urge everybody who owns a tenure, you should know that. You should have some of your youth just put this together, give you some graphs, show you what's going on in your area, because it's very geographically specific. That's coastal prices. The interior log market, $71. Right? That's the difference between this interior influence of pine, the dead pine from mountain pine beetle impacts, and the market condition. So you got this really challenging interior market condition of $70 a meter. You got this really high value old growth cedar thing on the coast. Very different worlds, right? Well, we're very different traditional territories too. So there's an interesting piece there. But if you own a tenure, you got to know what your tenure's worth. That's that selling price of the wood. And you're going to have to put somebody to work to find you the best selling price, right? They're going to have to sell that wood for you. And you can't just take your highest stuff and then leave all the other stuff to rot. You got to sell the whole package. So you're going to have a combination of different species, different high quality and low quality. You got to sort all that out. So maybe you got $90 a cubic meter you can sell it for. This is the link. I think this performance sheet is one of the most important things for a tenure. You need to link your business and your financial statements to the production. So what are we doing this year? 20,000 cubic meters. By the end of the year, somebody can do a nice audited financial statement for you and you can see some numbers there. But that doesn't tell you what happened on your tenure. What happens on your tenure is, how much did we pay for road building? And if you paid whatever it is, $200,000 for road building, and that was your bill from whoever you hired, well, you should convert that by the cubic meter so you can understand the price per cubic meter of your tenure. So you can have a consistent metric for analyzing and reviewing. And you'll find when you're talking or when you're researching and looking in the forest sector, almost everybody talks about it in dollars per cubic meter. So instead of talking about a $1.8 million cutting permit that you're about to log, it's, $90 a cubic meter. We'll make about $5. That's about it. Doesn't sound like much, but that's a that's almost a $2 million project. That's a significant piece of work. And so it gets very scaled down in review. And what's important is that there's a tremendous bit of wealth being generated by even these small tenures. So you should know road building on the coast in particular is a very expensive venture. The impacts with fish streams makes that an issue, and the rock conditions are very expensive. Falling, yarding, loading, those are all components that are the different phases, I guess, of the operation. So what you want to be able to do is break down your revenue, and then all these different phases are kind of a long list of typical phases for the logging operation. And they might be grouped together with your contractor. They might be individual. You might be doing some of it yourself with your own people. You might be, however you do it, you want to bring it all back so you have a good picture. Down at the bottom, yeah, this is, you signed a deal with the province, so you're going to pay stumpage to them. There's some kind of stumpage payment that you're paying to log this thing. And that's actually a significant number. We give a lot of money. I think the last time I looked, we pay more money back to the province in stumpage than any of our revenue sharing collections. So we got revenue sharing agreements. We share some of the revenue, but hey, we're doing all this work and generating stuff that goes back to the province to their benefit. It's a moot agreement. So hopefully you're getting other value out of it. Anyway, you get your revenue and your expenses, and now you have this. Sometimes a profit, sometimes this surplus of funds, and it can be really significant in your community. And I like a lot of that other discussion. Oh, all right. A lot of that other discussion that we talked about today and yesterday about how you prepare and how you have clear policies. Because all of a sudden you show up with $100,000, $200,000, or $1 million in surplus because of your forestry operation. How does that money get treated? Where does it go? And what are you doing with it? It's nice to have clear policies with that. Otherwise, it can unravel a lot of hard work in setting up your forestry operation. So I'm running out of time, but we talked about revenue. I was going to go a little bit more detail in some of the technical work that you do for timber cruising to assess what's there before you actually log it. Once you're finished, it's the law, you have to scale it. So every log that comes out, it's either weight scaled and measured at a weight, or it's piece scaled. Every piece of wood on the coast is measured by a technician. Its diameter, its volume, and quality is figured out, so we know exactly what that piece is going to be worth. But you go through the different estimating it before you do anything. Then you spend more money to have cruisers go in and do a statistical analysis to predict what that wood is worth. Then the log marketer will probably do his own walk because he'll want to review the crews with his markets and match value. And then when it's after logging, you're scaling it and you're actually seeing what you sold it for. You keep track of all that. This is tremendous knowledge about the resource that you're an owner of. Now, and expenses. Quickly on expenses, I talked about the phase costs and the pro forma. All of this works its way. You might negotiate, okay, I'll get a guy to log it and do all that for $40 a meter. But you should be able to work it all the way back to, and I just put up here a couple of things. We have a coast appraisal manual. That's the government's manual. It starts to publish. Well, how much should the engineering and planning cost on your tenure? Is it $4 a cubic meter or $5? You can see numbers like this in the appraisal manual. The Blue Book, interesting book developed by the highways guys and the heavy equipment road builders. They actually publish a book and document, well, what's the hourly rate for a piece of heavy equipment and the cost with an operator at a fair rate. And they've worked that out. So you can grab those numbers and you can say, oh yeah, I'm going to need a grapple yarder and it's going to have to work, how many shifts, how many hours are you going to put that equipment to work? That's how you can work the math all the way down to, well, what would it actually cost me if I wanted to start my own business and build it back up? Or if you've negotiated a deal and you're paying somebody $10 a cubic meter and you're wondering, gee, I wonder how much profit he made. How do I work that math all the way back? Well, somebody's going to start looking at all of that. And maybe you're not going to do that right now to start, but after 10 years of being a tenure manager, I hope you've learned some of this stuff. I hope you've figured that out. Your nation should own this knowledge by now. You should clearly know what your revenue and expense expectations are going to be in your territory, because, man, that's what it's all about here. And it's big business. Operations management, okay, you've got to own that too. Letting people go out and work in your territory with heavy equipment, building roads and doing what can be very dangerous and can be very destructive work. You have to have some oversight. You got to control that. Somebody should be there. You can't just rely on other people to work in your territory. In Nanaimuk, not too long ago, we had a heavy equipment contractor destroy pictograph rocks in our territory. How on earth in today's climate does some contractor end up there not knowing that there's that important cultural artifact and it got destroyed? We can't repair that. So we gotta be there in supervision and management and making sure stuff doesn't go wrong. Chance is getting closer to me, so I better try and wrap up. At the review and improve stage, this is actually the last phase of the assertion process too. It's critical. I think it has to happen on a very regular basis in a forestry tenure, especially now, 15 years of having tenures. How much review, critical review and improvement has happened? How much of those hard questions have been asked about us achieving our values and our benefits from them? Are we getting the economic benefit? Because I think that's one of the only things that's on the table in a lot of these things. So let's see it. Let's hear about it. Let's really understand it. You've got to evaluate it and you've got to move it forward. So the last things that I wanted to say about this and where we're headed with it is because the province has offered this opportunity for 15 years now, a lot of what people want to do is say, hey, where's the success story? Let's have a thing and talk about success. One of the biggest things with the forest opportunities is we're in transition. So let's look at this thing for what it is. It's a crown tenure. It's not our nation's governance. It's not our title and rights. It's a business and economic opportunity. It's an employment opportunity. It's a get to know your territory and what people are doing on it opportunity, getting paid well to be on your land, looking at it. It's got some really good benefits to getting in there. It doesn't have all the solutions. It doesn't have the stewardship solutions right now, but it can build some capacity. It can build some careers, some well-paying jobs for our people and some skills that we will want to use in our own management down the road. But let's not point to successes because BC government's happy with this agreement they've got us to sign, or because of truck loggers, Company X, or some industry partner is celebrating and wants to see that their name improved. We're not at that level yet. We're only in transition. But I think we should be all in. We definitely have taken the opportunities. Let's do that critical assessment. Let's start our assertion of title. Let's get our land use plans in place. Let's get our house in order. Let's express that to everybody. Let's let industry know clearly you can't work in my territory unless we're doing these things. Let's monitor it. Let's report on it. Some of the business stuff I think that doesn't happen is somebody's got to report back to our community's general membership about these things. The business is set up, great. There's a board of directors, great. But bring it all back, because that's how our communities expect it, and we don't do enough of that. And companies need to know that they have to do that. if they're going to be our partner and be involved. But for me, that's implementing tenures right now. It's a bittersweet opportunity, but we got to make the most of it. And I think a lot of the framework of the assertion process can help us make the most of that, and we should keep going with that strong position. So if we have time, take a few questions if anybody has any.
Well, the comments and questions that, or advice or whatever that we can get out of this. I noticed that since we got involved in taking part in having forest license within our communities, we have partnered up with a logging company, a small logging company. And our big problems that we've seen, I believe a lot of communities are probably going through the same thing. The discussions maybe 10, 15 years ago about value added seems to have gone out onto the wayside. There's really no opportunities now to actually get access to any of the fiber that the logging company, our partner, or any other logging company would access. Mainly, it just goes up in smoke. You know, and when I go hunting and I'm up in the mountains, I see truckloads that are full-length trees that you can build log cabins. You can do so much with all of this fiber that's out there, and really, it just goes up in smoke. It's devastating to see that there's no use for it for that market. We've asked on many occasions, is there a chance that we can have access to that? And we were always told, no, you're not. You can't touch it at a community level. It's like, well, I thought we were partners. I thought that's something that could be that we could make use of. And so I think even if we talk about this on the side, maybe I think there's a lot of other things that could come about for that kind of discussion. The other thing I notice is the visuals seem to favor the industry or tenure holders more so than it does the First Nation component, because of what the visual impacts are. Also include the traditional or cultural impacts. So I think those are issues that have to be brought up when we look at our involvement with this access to all of the forest tenure. The other part, not knowing and understanding what the pro forma estimates are and what the species that are in the blocks, all of that information. When we ask for it, we never get that information, and that's from our own partners. And we're like, we see all these loads going out, but we don't get that information, right? So I think what I'm looking for is that kind of support, that kind of knowledge. We don't have anyone within our communities that specializes in forestry, so I think this is an avenue that definitely would help for our communities. There's 2 other communities that probably seek the same kind of question and support for all of this, because it's been happening for way too long, and setting aside and giving the advantage, or, well, it's an advantage, but having the professionals, the foresters, the logging companies actually say, don't worry about it, we'll manage it for you guys, and then end up charging us a management fee for things that aren't even happening, right? So the forest license and the business venture that's there ends up costing, and we hardly ever get to see any of the monies come out. And so I think that kind of expertise is something really needed for us, probably others as well. But I've never seen a Scalers report, or never seen any other of those reports on the block layout, what the prescription is, we've never had an opportunity to be involved in any kind of tree planting in the last, I don't know, maybe 15, 20 years. So I think those are the things that comments and or questions that come about from today.
Thank you. Great comments, actually. And just to try and respond to a bit of that, the value added and the fiber utilization, that's definitely an interesting problem. And, I was quite surprised even trying to bring forward the concept of how to utilize fiber that's currently being burnt in burn piles. That's an extremely sensitive issue with industry and the government. For some reason, that policy framework that they've created to protect the fiber for themselves is at risk of being very heavily damaged if you just open that up and say, oh, okay, we're going to change the utilization standards. But it's not, a few companies are really protecting that right now as they try to contain how much fiber they control for this next couple decades, where there's real fiber supply coming down, and how to manage that. The problems with mountain pine beetle, like that, I think the province has known, and professionals look at it all the time, and we know that going from old growth harvesting levels in the province, which were at about 75 million cubic meters per year province-wide, that's how much we log while we're liquidating the old growth forests of the province. We've always known that the long-run sustained yield, once we finish the old growth, we're going to come down to logging second growth at a provincial level. It's more like 55, 60 million cubic meters. And so that's part of this transition that the whole sector is going through, and it's declining. And I think they have the mountain pine beetle epidemic fast-forwarded that. All of a sudden, a whole bunch of mature timber burnt up or died because the mountain pine beetle is at risk of burning up. And all of a sudden, that transition from this high harvest level to this long-term sustained level is quicker. It's coming upon us right now. It's happening. And so a lot of the innovation, the value-added money, like the province actually put in the Forest Innovation Investment Fund, big pool of money to go get. What did they spend it on? Oh, marketing the wood that we have in Asia or somewhere. Just trying to deal with the volume we have right now, but not really the utilization, not really the innovation stuff. We're still really struggling with this transition. I think it's going to be a tough transition. I think it comes back to our nation's really strongly expressing the stewardship. So look, no, you can't do this. This is our territory. You can't burn up our waste. It was a lot of hard fighting saying you can't use pesticides for brush control on our land. I don't know how long that took, but it's actually happening now where we're not using pesticides because enough First Nations say it constantly. We continue to do that. We have to do that kind of stuff with utilization. We have to express what we will accept and what we won't accept in the territory with these companies. The visuals, absolutely. This was actually one of the most interesting things for me when I was a young forester and I started working for Nisga'a Nation. When I met with the Nisga'a community about the impact of visual impact of logging in the territory, wow, it was completely different than the meetings we'd have with the public around terrace and in the region about forestry. Those standards for foresters and companies is completely different visual impact and what was acceptable. So there was a much bigger level. So what I'm saying is I've learned that from our communities, we're not actually involved in how the industry looks at the impact of the sector to the public. First Nations aren't part of that. We haven't been part of it in the whole construct because we're separate from BC, we're federal First Nations people. And so most times our communities aren't in there being recognized as, hey, this is visually important to us, or this is culturally. Those things are very downplayed. And so, again, that's us saying, hey, this is what our visual standard should be. This is what the cultural standard or conservation values, and we have to get that happening. And we have to get it in a way that we can tell foresters and we can tell companies, well, if you want to work with us, this is what we expect. I think most foresters will look at it and go, okay, I understand that. But they don't understand when we talk about our culture and our ways. They only understand it when it's in this procedural policy way. And if you can codify it that way, boom, a lot of people will be able to move to it. And the not knowing about the pro forma and the lack of reporting from your own partners, yeah, time to call BS. Like, it's like, hey, I need to know this. And I think that's what I was trying to show here is, well, that there's a simple level of what you can expect to know and you should know. Because you need to be able to collect that information today and every month or every year see the reports and see the trends and understand what's going on in your operations and in your territory so that you can make the decisions. And so, yeah, really good points and the challenges we're in front of.
Yeah, one of the things that we've seen in the past was just a little bit of financial report, not telling us actual road building costs, not telling us how much cubic meters and what species, but just like enough just to say, yeah, this is where we're at and this is how much money you should be getting, but because it cost us this much to do the work, so now at least we have something to use and have discussions. That's one of the joys that I have now as the new business manager, is to seek all of these questions and make sure that we have that. But I need to talk to somebody that has more involvement and has that skill set to respond with our partners to make sure that the wool's not being pulled over our eyes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. Thanks.
Susan Child from the Quaggiles Band. We've never ever signed an FCARSA because we were in court with BC, and we also didn't like the terms and conditions. The tenure was too small. I was wondering, is the First Nations Forestry Council and/or the Economic Development Support Team going to start discussions on changing the policy? We talk stewardship, protection, and old growth. When we let the old growth disappear off of our traditional territories, we're going to have no canoes, we're going to have no totem poles. That's a huge traditional part in all of our coastal areas. So I'm just wondering, what are the next steps so that we can change policy?
Yeah, awesome question. And so the Forestry Council absolutely looks to not so much changing the provincial policy, but trying to get the resources to allow nations to build their land use plans. So we've always argued that we were never part of the land use planning process properly. We need to be part of it. We tried to advocate and suggest that communities should do their own stewardship plans and go through a process of talking with the community about where your values lie, what is acceptable, and how you want to see old growth protected. You want to see a certain level of utilization if logging is going to happen. Get that stuff talked about so that you can express it and put it in a plan. A stewardship plan that the nation endorses is something that industry is hoping to get. Actually, it'll allow them to understand what your needs are. And I think that has to be done at each nation's level. So we're trying to find ways. The Forestry Council is usually trying to advocate for programs so the funding is available for nations to do that. The protective, this is definitely the gap, right? Like this is the old growth cedar is under huge threat right now on the coast. That's why I mentioned the cedar value. Cedar product as a forest product used to be waste material not that long ago for the industry. They didn't even take it out of the woods. Now it's the highest value product we have coming out of British Columbia. And so there's a ton of focus for companies wanting to log that old growth, get their hands on that old growth cedar, and they're signing whatever kind of deals they can to get at it. And you shouldn't be making those deals without proper planning, without proper consideration of how does this affect our territory, and I think the best language right now is if you say what your stewardship values are and can express it clearly, and if you can do that amongst nations as well. So if a number of nations in the area can all say that and get alignment, okay, now we're starting to do stuff. And the big thing with the conservation and the protection measure, which I definitely feel is necessary. It's also a leverage piece, and then I hope it's an introduction that, hey, we actually want to be in the economy of the forest sector too, but not at the cost of these things. So let's solve that together with industry and our partners. But until you can have that dialogue and actually work on that, maybe you shouldn't be doing anything. And so, it was when the FCURSA agreements actually came around, I see all of these agreements as take it or leave it type offers for tenure. The First Nations Forestry Council actually said no. We advocated to the chiefs, don't sign this agreement. This is a take it or leave it offer. If you sign it, you're letting industry operate in your territory, status quo, in exchange for this little opportunity you're getting, and it's not a good deal in almost all cases in that regard. So we got beat down heavy as a First Nations Forestry Council for standing up against the province in their program, and that was not healthy for our organization. But we have to stick to some of this stuff, right, and keep going along our path, because we have title. It's just getting it there, and I think our organization isn't the political leadership side. We're going to do the research and support that direction. But I like this forum on economic development. We have to build an economy in our territories, and those resources have tremendous wealth to offer. So how are we going to be part of that? And a bit of a long answer, but that's the heart of the conflict in forestry.